Welcome to Books of Titans. I'm Jason Staples together with Eric Rostad, and this podcast is dedicated to the influences of influencers. The books that have helped shape prominent inventors, business leaders, athletes, intellectual scientists, and others. And we'll talk about what makes these books so important and influential, and at least attempt to have an intelligent discussion about these important works. Today we're going to cover the book Dune by Frank Herbert. A book with the unassuming mantle of science fiction's supreme masterpiece. Often thought to be the finest work of science fiction out there in terms of literature. Kelly Starrett is who recommended the book in Tools of Titans. Kelly is a performance coach, trains a lot of CrossFit athletes, one of the early coaches in the CrossFit world. Also a DPT, a doctor of physical therapy. Known for being a supple leopard, in addition to being a mighty fine man, apparently. But he is the author of The Supple Leopard, which is a book on mobility and basic treatment for joints and muscles and so on, applying the basic principles, or many of the basic principles, of physical therapy and manipulation and bodily manipulation and so on. So good stuff.
You found that book quite helpful, correct?
Oh yeah, I use Becoming a Supple Leopard all the time. It's down underneath my coffee table where I keep, because I tend to do lots of, well, actually it's a milk table for me since I don't drink coffee, but anyway, I keep it under there because, I do a lot of my rolling and mobility work and such.
Maybe talk
down
about
there.
What kind of rolling, so we don't confuse our listeners.
Yeah, foam rolling. Although foam rollers are for the weak. If you want to use battle stars or other things a little bit more, that kind of rolling is what I mean.
Okay. Because Moe's restaurant has they've got a billboard in Atlanta right now that says "Been rolling in Atlanta since whatever year they started," and it's one of those restaurants, kind of like Mellow Mushroom, where you walk in and they've got some ulterior motives going on, but good food, so can't complain. But yeah, that Becoming a Supple Leopard book, I thought you were going to say that is your coffee table because the book is so large.
No, it's not. That's it. It's barely a dent compared to something like Dune, actually. But no, I do a lot of myofascial release and that sort of thing, and Becoming a Supple Leopard is a great resource for that stuff. Although, again, if you are familiar with enough physical therapy yourself, or if you are a DPT yourself. One physical therapist that I know likes to say that Kelly, in Becoming a Supple Leopard and just general approach, tends to, he has a lot of really good things to say, but he tends to, basically color everything with the color orange. So there are other approaches that are necessary for certain things. So it's not the panacea for everything, and sometimes you may have a real injury, a significant injury that needs a different kind of treatment, and Kelly would be the first person to acknowledge that. So important for those listeners who might run out and grab Becoming a Supple Leopard, which I, again, do highly recommend.
Well, and going into our book this week of Dune, speaking of big books, the author of Dune is Frank Herbert. He became famous for science fiction, and Dune is just one of many books in the series. But in addition to that, he was also a newspaper journalist, photographer, short story writer, book reviewer, ecological consultant, and lecturer. This is a pretty interesting little tidbit here. He was a distant relative of the controversial Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy, whom he referred to as Cousin Joe. McCarthy was part of the Red Scare, thinking everyone was communist, so and weeding out communists in the U.S. government. So Herbert was appalled to learn of McCarthy's blacklisting of suspect communists from working in certain careers, and believed that he was endangering essential freedoms of citizens of the United States. So we see a lot of political undertones in the writing of Dune. So it'll be fun to talk about that. But yeah, he pretty interesting that his distant relative was McCarthy himself. And then
Yeah.
I wanted to just highlight a few quotes that are from the very end of the book, and they're from Frank's son. So here's the first one. Despite all the work Dune required, my father said it was his favorite book to write. He used what he called a technique of enormous detail, in which he studied and prepared notes over a 4-year period between 1957 and 1961. So that's just the notes collection period, 4 years. Then he wrote and rewrote the book between 1961 and 1965. So we're looking at a 8 to 9 year total time of writing the book Dune.
And it's no surprise if you read this book that
Yeah,
it took that long.
yeah. And the second quote I wanted to highlight: a student of psychology, he, again, this is Frank's son speaking of Frank, the author, he understood the subconscious and liked to say that Dune could be read on any of several layers that were nested beneath the adventure story of a messiah on a desert planet. Ecology is the most obvious layer, but alongside that are politics, religion, philosophy, history, human evolution, and even poetry. So I wanted to share those two quotes, just one of the time period we're looking at of that it took to write this book, and then two, the different ways that that people have read into this book. So a lot of people see a lot of political commentary and even relation to U.S. politics of what was going on at that time. Other people see a lot of religious overtones, philosophy, history,
Well,
ecology.
and it's fair to say not just that people read these things into them, but Herbert himself is explaining that all of those layers are in there, and that the book can and should be read with those layers in mind, which is interesting.
Yeah. And then, did you have a few other
Yeah, I had a
quotes
couple
from the end?
others. Yeah, from the end as well. I thought this also was interesting, where he said, having studied politics carefully, my father believed that heroes made mistakes, mistakes that were simplified by the number of people who followed such leaders slavishly. And again, I think it's interesting because he really goes out of his way in this book to create round characters and to create realistic scenarios in a fantasy, unrealistic kind of world, but to bring in the way that things work so that you can sort of experience them and then see what some of the potential pitfalls would be. And it's very clear that he wanted the reader to understand potential mistakes, potential problems with the way that things are. This book is in many ways a critique of the ways that human beings tend to go about things in terms of government and religion and other things, while also just being something of a revelation of how those things actually work. So I thought that was I thought he really artfully did that, and then. I thought this piece, this section at the end that his son brings in as well, is one of the reasons that this book is so compelling. I think his son says at the end of the book, he intentionally left loose ends and said he did this to send the readers spinning out of the story with bits and pieces of it still clinging to them, so that they would want to go back and read it again. A neat trick, and he pulled it off perfectly. Whether he pulled it off perfectly or not is perhaps a matter of readers' opinion. Although it seems that, given the popularity of the book, many readers do agree with this. I do think that this technique is really important for constructing a good narrative and a compelling world. If you're going to write fiction, and really if you're going to write any sort of narrative at all, you have to construct a world that is believable. And one of the things that J.R.R. Tolkien actually talks a lot about is the necessity in a constructed world, in a narrative context, for leaving off the edges. You have to blur the edges, and you have to give the impression that there's a much, much larger world out there of which we're only seeing a piece, if the world is going to be compelling and enthralling for the viewer, or for the listener, for the hearer, the
Mm.
reader. And this is something, he talks about, if you've read Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, there's a character in there called Tom Bombadil, and there's some question as to how Bombadil actually fits into the larger narrative in a lot of ways. And yeah, there's actually some really important things that end up happening with the events that surround Tom Bombadil. But at the same point, as most cinematic treatments of Lord of the Rings have displayed, you can do Tolkien in Lord of the Rings perfectly well without Tom Bombadil. He's completely ancillary to the story, really. But Tolkien actually talks about how it's important to have that kind of character, where you leave off and you're like, wait, what happens with, like, what's going on with that guy? Like, this person's walking by, talking along the road. I mean, even down to like Monty Python, where you've got the guy, you've got the Monty Python and the Holy Grail. You've got the couple people that are constantly walking through scenes discussing various arcane aspects of Marxist philosophy. It gives you the impression that, like, wait, this whole thing, like, there's a larger world out there that this doesn't quite fit in, and it makes you have to think. Well, what Herbert does is he does a great job of giving the impression that you're only seeing a little piece of the world that he's constructed, that this is a much larger world, that there are events going on out there that just aren't part of our story, but there's lots of stuff that's going on out there, just like the real world.
Mm.
And that makes things much, much more compelling. And I thought he did a fantastic job of constructing the world and leaving those loose ends. And actually, there is, interestingly, a cinematic reflection of this, of the necessity of that technique. There's a cinematic discussion of this in the movie Inception, where in Christopher Nolan's depiction, in Christopher Nolan's explanation, he has his main character, Dom Cobb, explaining how dream construction, in the context of that movie, where you basically can invade other people's dreams and share them with them, and in order to share the dream, you have to construct a dream world that you can inhabit with that particular with your fellow co-dreamer. And he says, in order to construct a world that works in a dream world, you have to make it like a maze, where you basically keep your character from ever wandering off the edge, because as soon as the character can see that there's an edge there, he'll recognize that it's not reality.
Yeah.
And so you have to bend the edges and deal with, you have to make it so that the horizon is, it appears distant and falls off and all this. And you use all sorts of, and there's a whole scene about this. You use all sorts of in the movie world, you use all sorts of optical illusions and things to give the impression of continuation. But these are shortcuts, these are cheats, so that you don't actually have to have an infinite world. You have, they use things like the infinite staircase and things like that as an example of this. And in the storytelling world, you have to use the same kinds of rhetorical illusions to do the same sorts of things. And of course, Inception is Christopher Nolan's meditation on creating a fictional world, like in a movie or in a narrative, in any sort of narrative creation, to share and inhabit with someone else, by which you end up shaping their mind and so on. Our minds are shaped by the narratives that we share with other people. And so this is a good example, a good sort of partner for the way that he discusses how Herbert does that with Dune. And it's something that I think lesser storytellers often do a poor job of. And one of the reasons that amateur novelists and amateur storytellers don't do as good of a job is they are trying to explain everything, and they try to make sure that all the loose ends and everything are tied up, because it would seem on the front end of things that that's a necessary thing to do. But the reality is that better stories, more compelling stories, are the ones that don't tie up all the loose ends and leave those fuzzy boundaries and give you the impression that you're in a larger world than just the story that's being told to you.
Well, and the other thing that was amazing to me is even with them leaving this idea of there being a more expansive world out there, the level of detail they give to the world that you're reading about is is unbelievable. I mean, both authors create extensive maps, um, lay of the land, everything. I mean, it's just amazing the level of detail, and that was one of my favorite parts of reading this book. Was just think of the imagination that goes into creating a world, writing about it, having characters in it. That part was really really intriguing to me. So both Herbert and Tolkien do an amazing job of that as well.
Yeah, and actually, I think in many respects, Dune, as I was reading it, I kept coming back to this is it's a different genre. It's science fiction as opposed to fantasy, but it really is fantasy. It really is very much of a piece with something like Lord of the Rings. So if you like Lord of the Rings, if you like, C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, if you like if you liked the Chronicles of Narnia when you were a kid, this is the kind of book that's really going to appeal to you. You're going to enjoy it. It'll knock your socks off. You'll love it because it's the sort of world building and imaginative writing that is right up your alley if you're the kind of person that enjoys those sorts of stories.
I don't know. We'll go into the overview here, and
We've already
I
been
went
in the
in.
overview a little bit.
What? Yeah. I went into reading Dune as a sci-fi skeptic, and I came out of reading the book as a sci-fi skeptic. Uh, and this just goes across the board. And I know what I'm saying here is blasphemous to you, Jason, and probably to many of the listeners. But whether it's a movie or a book, I've just really never been all that into science fiction, fantasy. But what's odd about what you just said is I really did like the Chronicles of Narnia, but didn't like the Tolkien books as much. And then even I know it's not sci-fi, but like even a lot of the comic book movies that are out now that are popular, I can't get into those either. And so it's like anything to do with crazy worlds. I think part of it is just it's hard for me to grasp the whole world, learn about the world, learn different types of animals, creatures, all that kind of stuff, and then also follow the story. And so one thing I did with Dune is I really made a effort more so than books in the past of really trying to take it slow and understand the world, understand the characters. Took a lot of notes and that kind of thing, but it's still I just had a hard time with it, and I think it is for that reason. It's like learning a language of a world without any outside application. Anything I learned about Dune, I could apply to the other books in the Dune series, but that's it. I know there's the story there. There's a lot that we can gather out of the story, and that's what we'll be talking about. But I'd rather read a book, for instance, a few books later where it's Once an Eagle. That's also a novel, but while you're reading it, you're learning about World War I, you're learning about the Cold War, you're learning about World War II, Vietnam, and that can be applied to other books or other things that you read, or just learning about those wars in general. So for my time, I'd rather read a non-science fiction novel. I went in as a skeptic, came out as a skeptic, but convince me otherwise, Jason.
All I have to say is boo this man. Boo. Right about now is where we need the booing from the Princess Bride, boo, boo, the Queen of Refuse.
Probably put that in as a
the Queen of Filth. All this boo. That's more or less where I come in there. First of all, I'm a little bit surprised that you would have liked, if that's the way you feel about fantasy in general, I'm surprised you would have liked the Chronicles of Narnia. because they are very much fantasy novels, even though
Yeah.
they're much simpler. They're designed more for younger children than some of these. These are young adult fantasy as opposed to those which are, I suppose, younger adult fantasy. Um, but but yeah, actually I got a question, and this is
Yeah.
something that our listeners should know at least. Is where do you fall in on sci-fi or fantasy type fictional movies?
No, that's the same thing, and that's what I was trying to get at with like the comic book movies, whether it's Superman or anything.
Well,
I have
those
a
are
hard time
the
with those.
Superman movies tend to be terrible too, but the Marvel cinematic universe
Yeah,
is
Marvel.
typically really well
I
done.
can't get in. I can't get into Marvel. It's been the same with Star Wars, Star Trek. I don't know what it is, but I can't get into those, and
It's just like
it's
a
been for a
disease.
while.
It's like a
Yeah, I mean, I
disease.
like
It
when I was
really
a kid.
is.
Well, but I think one thing that's interesting is like when I was a kid, I liked Star Wars, and when I was a kid, that's when I read. I haven't read the whole Narnia series, but I've read at least two of the books, but I read them when I was a kid. So I don't know if that's something different of when I read those and when I watched the
See,
Star Wars, I liked it, but I'd say high school on, I've just never been into movies that are fantasy or sci-fi. I just have a hard time with them, and I don't know why.
see that brings us into a little bit of uh a little bit of light onto this, where what's happened is you've unfortunately reached that middle point of your life where you need to become like a child again. As C.S. Lewis himself once wrote, "When I was 10, I read fairy tales in secret and would have been ashamed if I had been found doing so. Now that I am 50, I read them openly. When I became a man, I put away childish things, including the fear of childishness and the desire to be very grown up." Or even better, another quote by C.S. Lewis, which which comes from the foreword to his Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. "I wrote this story for you, but when I began it, I had not realized that girls grow quicker than books. As a result, you are already too old for fairy tales, and by the time it is printed and bound, you will be older still. But someday, you will be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. You can then take it down from some upper shelf, dust it, and tell me what you think of it. I shall probably be too deaf to hear and too old to understand a word you say, but I shall still be your affectionate godfather."
I
So
like that.
I think the problem here, now that we've had you sitting on the couch for a couple minutes, the real problem here has been that you grew too old for fairy tales, and you're not yet old enough to start reading fairy tales again. So one of these days you will grow back into these things, and then you too shall be a man, my son.
Well, I need to start putting all these books into one bookshelf then, the fantasy sci-fi bookshelf, and then once I hit that age,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
can
I think
revisit
that's
it.
that's a good place to be. No, I mean, it is interesting because I do think that there are certain personality types, there are certain people that tend to really dig this stuff much more than others. I know my mother-in-law just has like zero tolerance for fantasy or generally fictional world building that's not like doesn't feel exactly like this world, except that
Yeah.
she likes romance, right? Which of course
Fabio.
is nothing like this world, right? So, a romantic movie, oh, that can be fine now.
Yeah.
But of course, it's nothing like this world. I think that's just as fantastic as Dune, right? The Notebook is every bit as like fantasy, as much fantasy as Dune. But Dune is far more interesting. Um,
Yeah.
but actually, beyond getting you on the analyst's couch here, a word of defense for this kind of book and its application is worthwhile, and that is, again, going back to Inception. this is a really, really important lesson for everybody to learn, and that's that narrative, that human beings function fundamentally on the basis of narrative. We don't do very well. In fact, we don't do at all when we're stripped away from the stories that we tell ourselves. Everything we do is geared off of narrative. We tell ourselves stories of who we are, where we came from, and we think of ourselves in that way. That's the only way that we function as human beings. Christian Smith, the sociologist, talks about this as human beings are narrative animals. They're storytelling animals is how he refers to it. And again, going back to the movie Inception, it talks about how human beings tend to be resistant to ideas that come from outside of our sphere. A foreign idea it can be resisted, and the image in the book is actually, I'm just going to go to a couple quotes here. One is a quote from Inception that I'm just going to play.
What is the most resilient parasite? Bacteria? A virus? An intestinal worm?
What Mr. Cobb is trying to say?
An idea. Resilient, highly contagious. Once an idea has taken hold of the brain, it's almost impossible to eradicate. An idea that is fully formed, fully understood, that sticks. Right in there somewhere.
Now, the thing about that quote is, yeah, ideas that are fully formed, fully understood, stick, and they're almost impossible to eradicate because they become a part of a person, just like a virus does. And, this is something that I, as an educator, reflect on all the time, because ideas are the most powerful thing in the world.
Well, and I think you nailed it with a recent tweet you did, where you were describing a particular worldview that has a narrative about a particular topic, and there's a very conflicting.
Oh yeah.
Topic.
You're talking about.
You said Group One is never going to adapt that topic because it doesn't fit in their overall narrative.
Yeah, you're talking about the climate change issue.
Mm-hmm.
And you have lots of people that, the apocalyptic climate change rhetoric is never going to persuade someone who comes from an evangelical apocalypticist type worldview where they hold to the idea that, the world's going to continue getting worse and worse, and earthquakes and hurricanes and all this stuff is going to increase up until the time that Jesus comes, because those are signs of the end. Well, if you're going to say, look, the earthquakes in the Atlantic have gotten so much worse, and they're more frequent now than ever, which is actually not completely true. But even if it were true, these hurricanes are worse than ever, and they're getting more frequent. So this is a sign that we're doing something wrong, and that that we need to address this because it's a climate change problem. Well, yeah, that can work from one particular narrative point, but for the person who's already embraced the narrative that, well, Jesus is coming back, and these things are going to get more severe and more an increase in frequency until Jesus comes back, and that's the sign of it. Well, they already have a place to put that in their narrative, right?
Yeah.
But the thing is, what this gets to is ideas. They're really powerful, and as an educator, I believe that. But the thing is, it's so hard; it's almost impossible to transmit a fully formed, fully understood idea from one person to another, right? The quote says, an idea that's fully formed, fully understood, that sticks. But when was the last time you really were able to transmit a fully formed, fully understood idea from you to somebody else, or from somebody else to you? It almost never happens.
Mm-hmm.
Real learning, if somebody's actually going to learn, it has to happen through this process of internal discovery. So teaching, in that sense, I can't teach somebody else. I can only help expose them to what they need to be able to learn, right? So, and that's why instruction from the outside, lecture and this sort of thing, rarely penetrates deeply enough to have a lasting impact. And even if it does penetrate deeply enough for a person to begin to understand something, This is where, again, the mind resists the outside ideas. So getting back to that idea of, climate change and having conflicting narratives that you're committed to, if the data point doesn't fit at this point in your narrative, you may just reject the data point. Your body rejects pathogens, and your mind tends to resist ideas that are foreign to its particular narrative. The narratives that it has embraced, the meta-narrative that is your identity. And so again, the mind resists outside ideas, much like white blood cells fight pathogens. And in Inception, this is precisely how the subconscious is explained. That, you try to introduce an outside idea in someone's dream state and introduce that from the outside. As soon as it's recognized as something from the outside, the mind attacks it and eradicates it. And it prevents the idea from taking root unless, and here's the trick, and this is the trick in Inception, that idea is recognized by the mind as somehow fitting into the pre-existing foundational narratives of that person's inner world, right? So you have to find a way to find common narrative ground and fit some new lesson or new data point into that common narrative substructure so that the idea can actually take. And that's what's necessary to really teach. And that's why movies, music, various forms of entertainment, but particularly movies, television, books, things that have a clear narrative that people can participate in, those are the most powerful agents of identity, morality, teaching that exist. Because what happens is you embrace the narrative and ideas from the outside can be introduced to the mind without the mind even recognizing that the idea was introduced, and so the idea is actually accepted. It actually takes root. It actually begins to have an impact on the mind. So what you're saying is, well, you're learning the language of a world, but there's no outside application to it. That's not entirely true. Mm-hmm. Because what happens is by sharing in another world, in an outside world, a world in which you actually don't have commitments, right? The mm-hmm. beauty of fantasy and the beauty of creating an alternate world, a world that is outside the one that you actually live in. And again, this is true in a biblical world, right? You go back and you read Genesis, and that's not our world. That's a world of, right? A world gone by. We don't have, there's no Ruskies and Americans there where you're rooting for Rocky, right? Because you're an American. Mm-hmm. You're placed into that narrative, and you are at the mercy of the narrator on what kinds of views and what kinds of commitments you're going to take on, who you're going to identify with. And so what ends up happening is you end up sharing a world, sharing a mind with someone else that's foreign to your own mind, your own world, your own experience, and then get to engage and encounter how various characters and how various events and how various decisions are made, how those how these things are transpiring, how people think, right? Mm-hmm. So then what happens is that shapes the way that you think about analogous things in this world, one way or another. Mm-hmm. And so those stories, even though they're only tangentially related to this world, they're ostensibly about another world. They actually are ways of analogously getting people to think about things in this world and shape the imagination and moral leanings and inclinations of the reader. So that also, by the way, goes to say that for those of you who are parents out there or even choosing what you want for yourself, if you're choosing literature for your kids, it's important to understand what kinds of worlds those people are building and what kinds of decisions the the authors of these books and the characters of these books are actually pushing. Because when we read these books, we share together with the mind of the person that's actually put us into that world. Those ideas infect us for however long, and they can be good ideas. They can be bad ideas. You can construct a world in which you're actually steering people to think in ways that are really awful. And it's interesting that some of the best authors in history have been phenomenally good at getting people inside the mind of psychopaths, basically. I mean, one of my favorite books is Crime and Punishment. It's one of the most formative books on me in my life.
Yeah, me too.
And Dostoevsky does an unreal job of putting you inside the mind of someone who's basically a lunatic, a total psychotic. And by doing so, you start to learn that, oh my goodness, that he is me.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Yeah.
that like I could do the same things that this person did. Like, and that's the thing. That's one of the amazing things about Crime and Punishment. It's also one of the great things about something like Dune is that, for someone who may be of certain political leanings, some of the lessons that come across in Dune would be resisted if they were written about, say, Vietnam, or if they were written about World War II or whatever. But because they're written about an area that has that no one has allegiance to, they actually can be potentially accepted and received, which means that then when that next generation goes to consider what's going on in Vietnam or what's going on in, the latest example, or Afghanistan or whatever, they may be a little bit more likely to consider some of the data points that they learned from Dune. Right? It's war games. It's just like that sort of it's war game drills for the mind, like what you would get at a war college. It's just in a different domain.
Well, and it's funny to go back to our intro of his distant relative being Joseph McCarthy, because McCarthy was it was all overt.
Right.
Does this person have any leanings? And so trying to change behavior on an overt level. Whereas if Herbert's using science fiction to do that, it's all kind of as you're describing. It opens up a door to a person that they would never allow otherwise. It's just kind of interesting if we're just taking those two people to compare and contrast how they went about the other in terms of the other political side. McCarthy fighting overtly and Herbert through sci-fi.
Yeah, and Herbert is by no means a communist, although he is very suspicious of power.
Yeah.
And and again, he wants his reader to understand all sorts of potential pitfalls and understand the nature of how politics really work and all sorts of things. And he exposes you to some of these things in some of the really awful in some cases, but either way really compelling twists and turns in this narrative.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyway, that's my defense of this kind of the nature of this kind of work. And I think it's actually really important for people to be able to read, various types of fantasy and utopian literature and apocalyptic literature, post-apocalyptic literature, these sorts of things, because it helps teach us a lot about who we are, and it exposes us to the inward world of other people in ways that we can't encounter. I have no access to your thoughts, but I can have access to something approximating someone's thoughts by joining in a shared narrative with, that was constructed by an author who's putting, sort of indirectly thoughts on paper in that way. So that's the real value of this beyond just the enjoyment of it. And I think that's one of the reasons humans enjoy it is because there is something fundamentally human about being able to deal with some of these things. Anyway, let's go ahead and get into the favorite quotes, and there's a number of them in here. Even though you weren't as big of a fan of this book, you've got a few quotes that I see on the show notes here, and I've got my share as well. So let's go ahead and get to that section of the podcast.
All right. My first one, and this was repeated quite often in the book: the power to destroy a thing is the absolute control over it. So I'm just going to kind of let that one speak for itself, but we find it quite often in the book.
Yeah. All right, another one for me is the rebuke to when one of the characters is about to leave a place and is asking another person, "Oh, are you sad about having to leave this place?" And the other person, who's older, corrects him and says, "Sad? Nonsense. Parting with friends is a sadness. A place is only a place." And I think we would do well to remember that all the time.
Yeah, my grandpa always said, because they would kind of like your grandparents, they would spend half the year up north, half the year in the south, and a lot of their friends up north didn't like that they did that because they were away from them for 6 months or something. And my grandpa would always say, "Home is where my hat is." So wherever I put my hat, that's where home is. But with that idea in mind of it was the people that he was around that he really enjoyed, and it wasn't place. But yeah, I don't know. I've kind of always had a sentimental connection with place as well. So
and it's easy to do, but it's important. It's easy for that to develop, and there's nothing wrong with it. But it's important to remember that the real attachment should be to people.
Yeah. Yep.
All right, next.
Yeah, that's a good one. Once men turned their thinking over to machines in the hope that this would set them free, but that only permitted other men with machines to enslave them. So this was a comment, a quote in looking back at what happened. So once men turned their thinking over to machines in the hope that this would set them free, but it allowed other people with machines to enslave them. And this was written in the 60s, but that could be a good thing to think on as we give more and more of our attention and thinking over to machines. It's pretty easy for people to manipulate what we see, and just to be aware of that. And I know we talked a lot about this kind of stuff in the Inevitable episode, but that one got me thinking a little bit.
Yeah, that's another good one, and one that I almost had on there myself, because I especially think that we tend to do that. Okay, another one. Think of the fact that a deaf person cannot hear. Then, what deafness may we not all possess? What senses do we lack that we cannot see and cannot hear another world all around us? What is there around us that we cannot, and then it gets interrupted in this flow of the narrative, but that we cannot perceive is the idea. And I like that. Think of the fact that a deaf person cannot hear. A deaf person doesn't have the experience of really knowing what they lack, unless that person went deaf after the fact. What deafness may we not also possess in the same sort of way?
Very Walden-esque. I think, like when Thoreau was talking about the things that we look back on older generations and think, what were you thinking? But we can't see what we're going to be criticized for.
So I'll go with another one real quick. Another one that's very Walden-esque. What is money? Kynes asked. If it won't, what is money? Kynes asked. If it won't buy the services you need. You have a character that was asking, whether something could be, well, surely this could be done with enough money. And the person is saying, money is not the problem here. What good is money if it's not going to buy the services you need? The issue is that you need these services to be done, and that's going to require something other than money, isn't it? Mm. And that gets to one of the real themes of this book, which has to do with the distinction between money as a as an agent of power, as a tool of power, as a motivational, as an aspect of motivation, versus allegiance as the and trust and faith as a source of power and as a source of strength and so on. And looking at the differences between these things, rule by gaining the allegiance of those around you versus rule by having money and these sorts of things, and looking at some of the differences there. That's a big theme throughout this book.
Mm-hmm. My next one starts with, we came from Caledon, paradise world for our form of life. There existed no need in Caledon to build a physical paradise or a paradise of the mind. We could see the actuality all around us. And the price we paid was the price men have always paid for achieving a paradise in this life. We went soft. We lost our edge.
So that's such a good quote, and it gets to that. The one of the greatest enemies of success is success, right? It's so difficult to sustain success because you lose your edge. Yeah. And there's a related quote just after that where it says, if you were going to raise tough, strong, ferocious men, what environmental conditions would you impose upon them? And how could you win the loyalty of such men? There are proven ways. Play on the certain knowledge of their superiority, the mystique of a certain covenant, the esprit of shared suffering. It can be done. It has been done on many worlds in many times. So it's the opposite thing, right? Hardship can actually bring about that tough ferocity and a certain esprit of shared suffering that actually brings in that fosters a certain pleasure to it, which is an interesting paradox. And I thought that was an interesting piece to get brought together. Now I'm gonna go with another one. I've got a couple additional here. Let's see. There is probably no more terrible instant of enlightenment than the one in which you discover your father is a man with human flesh.
I've seen that a lot.
Yeah.
In other places, it's.
Yeah, and it's true.
Shock. Yeah.
It's true. It is one of those things where, growing up, you hear people talk about this all the time. Growing up, I thought grown-ups had it together, knew what they were doing and all this. And now that I'm a grown-up, I realize that they just really had no idea what they were doing and were just trying to make it up as they went along. And when you realize that, it's a terrible instant of enlightenment of, wait, when I grow up, that doesn't mean I'm actually going to have things figured out.
Yeah. Yep. Here's another one of mine. The mind can go either direction under stress, toward positive or toward negative. Sorry, not toward positive or toward the negative. On or off. Think of it as a spectrum whose extremes are unconsciousness at the negative end and hyperconsciousness at the positive end. The way the mind will lean under stress is strongly influenced by training.
Oh, yeah. And again, that's really true.
That is so good. And then I talk about this in another podcast episode, but I always just think back to the Costa Rica incident when I was robbed at gunpoint. I did the first option there. My mind just went blank, and that is not the way you want to go. But I guess you probably don't want to go hyper conscious either, to where you think you can fight your way out of it.
Hyper conscious is fine if you know how to respond
if you've been trained
in that hyper conscious state. You want to go hyper conscious to the point of
been trained.
Right. You want to get into that flow state where everything slows down so that you can make good decisions.
Yeah. And avoid bullets like the Matrix.
Yes, exactly. It would have helped when you were held at gunpoint for sure.
Yeah.
So,
but yeah, that's and that'll play into a lot of the books we have coming up. But that idea then of training as well.
Yeah, and dodging bullets.
Yeah.
What do you despise? By this you are truly known. Ooh. Yeah. That I'm just gonna leave that one sit. All right, and then there's let's see. He realized suddenly that it was one thing to see the past occupying the present, but the true test of prescience was to see the past in the future. So it's one thing to see the past occupying the present, but the real test, the true test of prescience, was to see the past in the future. So not to see how the past has brought things up to the present. Anybody can potentially do that. But when you can see that how the past is embedded in the future, now you're starting to get somewhere. That's an interesting distinction.
Well, and that reminds me of the most recent Ferris podcast episode where he interviewed Ray Dalio.
Dalio, yeah, Dalio.
And Ray Dalio said he's a huge consumer of history, and he does that very thing. He tries to see something that happened in the 30s being replayed right now. He's not trying to see how what happened in the 30s led up to what's happening now. He tries to see where the same exact or very similar situations that we have now that were in the 30s or the 1800s or way back when. He tries to find different parts in history to help him make sense of what is happening right now. That was a really interesting part of that particular podcast episode. Let's see. I'll do my final one here. Or
Yep.
you've got a few more. Once you
Yeah,
do
I can go a couple of those pretty quickly though. So go ahead and do yours.
Okay. The concept of progress acts as a protective mechanism to shield us from the terrors of the future. And along with your quote about discovering your father as a man, this is something that I've thought about probably more in the last 10 years as opposed to early life. But this thought of like things always getting better, and we've got new technology coming, and we've got this and just kind of this idea that things are always getting better, constantly being reminded of the progress, whether it's technological or advancements in ideas or different things, and to shield us from a potentially horrible future that could be happening. You had a quote that kind of tied in with that.
Yeah, actually, I had picked another quote about progress. It was related, that religion often partakes of the myth of progress that shields us from the terrors of an uncertain future. So it's building on the quote that you had, and this idea that religion is actually fostering that larger myth that things are getting better, we're progressing towards something, and instead of there being uncertainty in the future. And actually it's interesting because C.S. Lewis wrote a good bit about this as well. This what he referred to as the myth of progress. We'll link it in the show notes. Lewis's article, "Funeral of a Great Myth," or "The Funeral of a Great Myth." And Lewis basically says, that the modern notion of progress is, completely a it's not the way that things actually work. That there's a picture of a reality that results in ever-present progress. And this was every bit as popular in his day as it is in ours. I mean, all the way up to Nietzsche, expecting that if we could just eliminate the mercy for the poor and taking care of the sick and the weak among us, and weed those people out, that we could finally finish evolving into Übermenschen. If we would just make sure that power was properly at the top rung in our ethic that it should be, that we would just progress into something beyond human that would be even greater. This idea of progress goes all the way down to that, and Lewis writes pretty heavily against this idea, what he refers to as developmentalism, or this great myth that things are going to consistently get better. So,
well, what's funny about your quote is it says that religion often partakes of the myth of progress. But I would say Christianity is kind of the opposite.
Christianity tends to be, yes.
pretty bleak future.
It is. So the interesting thing there is that on the one hand, Christianity is bleak in its view of humanity, in its view of the direction of the present world and the present world order. But at the same point, it still steps in and says, yeah, but things are eventually going to be brought right and are eventually going to be set into proper order, so that even if it's not progressing proper, it's not actually progressing into something, the steps that we see now aren't actually going to build into something better. They're actually going to either stay the same or perhaps get worse. There's no reason for any expectation of improvement in the general condition of things in that respect. At some point, there's going to be a fundamental break with how things work in the world, and then God's going to set things right. So at least that does still provide some reassurance against uncertainty, in that if you are on the side of right and you fight and you are on the side of allegiance with the justice of God, then when things are set right, then you'll be okay. So there isn't uncertainty in that sense as well. So you could potentially apply a similar critique, even though it's not necessarily that of progress in the fundamental Christian myth.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's see. A couple other things. I'll go through a few really rapidly here. One of my favorites, I really liked this one, was we can say that Muad'Dib learned rapidly because his first training was in how to learn. And the first lesson of all was the basic trust that he could learn. It is shocking to find how many people do not believe they can learn, and how many more believe learning to be difficult. That's a brilliant quote. And it highlights so much of what makes teaching difficult in some cases, but it makes life so much more difficult for so many people, in that they've really never learned how to learn and learn well, nor have they learned that real learning, that actually the application and process of learning is not only not that difficult, but it's a joy. Mm-hmm. And if you learn that, everything in the world is open to you.
And I mean, that should really be the first point of education.
Yep. Yeah. That, and what we do a terrible job of in the U.S. education system, one of the things we do absolutely the worst is training people how to learn, and we also find ways to make learning unpleasant throughout the school experience, which to me, that is a twofold tragedy that costs us a tremendous amount of productivity and a great deal of joy in our society. It is a crime that we don't teach people very early in life how to learn. Fundamentally, this is how to learn, and then help reinforce the joy of learning. If we did that, it'd be amazing how much better our education system would be, because you wouldn't really need to do as much on some of those other things. But
and you couldn't really blame too many other people either.
Yep, you really couldn't. So, final quote: "Deep in the human consciousness is a pervasive need for
unconscious."
Yes. Yeah. Deep in the human unconscious is a pervasive need for a logical universe that makes sense. But the real universe is always one step beyond logic." So, yes, it's logical, and it's one step beyond logic. I like that. I related to that.
That's pretty good.
All right, so with that, we're going to go ahead and enter the potential spoiler zone of the podcast. That's going to, so far we've talked about big picture things. We've talked about a number of quotes and so on, but nothing that really would impact a person's ability to read this book without, basically spoiler free. But we're now going to get into possible discussion that could possibly have some spoilers. So for if you want to read this book, if you haven't read the book and you want to read this book and avoid spoilers, then go ahead and skip forward. about 32 and a half minutes to 1:31:53, and we'll go ahead and wrap it up with more big picture stuff at that point. But for the rest of you, now we'll go ahead and get into a little bit more detail on potential spoilers, although we probably won't get too far into that. So, Eric, you had some stuff you definitely wanted to talk about here.
Yeah, and mine just had more to do with the style of writing. One thing I really liked is that Frank would do three different things.
Oh, you're on a first name basis with him now.
Yeah. Now that I've shared with the podcast community how I was not very impressed with the book. Well, I was impressed, but I just don't like it. I don't like sci-fi is what I've concluded, and I was hoping I would after this book. But one thing I did appreciate was whenever characters were in a dialogue, you would hear what the character was saying, so you would hear what was actually coming out of their mouth, but he would also write what the character was thinking, and so that would be italicized, and then you would also hear what other characters were thinking about what was going on. So I know this happens a lot in novels and in different writings, but it was just cool because you got a lot of different perspective on what was going on. It wasn't just what was being said, but actually what was being thought while the thing was being said, and then what other people thought about what was being said, both outwardly and inwardly. And it just made for a really interesting read, especially in one particular chapter where they were sitting down for a dinner. And it was that, I mean, that chapter alone was just unbelievable. I mean, just the level of looks and thoughts and behind the scenes stuff going on. That chapter blew me away.
Yeah, and he has a way of doing it. Like he doesn't tend to overload with thoughts. He just, and in many cases, with certain characters, Kynes, for example, you don't really get what he's truly thinking inside until later. But when he does start reporting on thoughts, you start to realize, like, oh, there's some serious stuff going on here. And one of the things that I found interesting about that is how compelling that was, in terms of it's hard to believably write how people think. Right? That's one of the things that makes Dostoevsky so brilliant, is he's actually capable of getting you to believe that his character is thinking the way that his character's thinking, because it's the way you might think in that situation. That's one of the things
you feel like you're going in with him.
It's one of the things that Chesterton said about Jane Austen, is that she was the only female writer that he had read that was able to accurately represent, at least in his view, male motivations and thoughts and so on. And so, and he paralleled that he contrasted that to the Bronte twins, where he's like, yeah, their idea of how a man thinks is not really realistic. So, but he's like, Austen, on the other hand, like, she gets psychology. And when you get an author that really understands how people think and how people function, that really makes a story and a narrative sing. And I think Herbert does a really good job in doing that in this. He understands psychology.
Yeah, it was excellent. And as you said, I mean, the italicized thoughts, I mean, they'd usually just be a sentence, so it's not like you're digging deep. But
he told himself.
Yeah, not like you're digging deep, but like it really does help drive the story along and make it a lot more intriguing.
Yeah, I thought, there were some interesting now it could get complex, but I thought that the analysis of leadership, but it's analysis by narrative revelation, that the way that leadership is addressed and political intrigue is addressed is really fascinating, because you get to see how different leaders lead differently, and you get to see some of the potential pitfalls and some of the benefits and some of the weaknesses of various management styles and various ways of either leading or dictating or whatever, that I thought that was really one of the more interesting layers of this story, is looking at how, say, the Harkonnens rule versus, their rivals who rule very differently, and each one has weaknesses that can be manipulated or taken advantage of by the opposition, but then it may, like, taking advantage of that weakness may actually make you vulnerable in another area because their counter. It's sort of like one of those role playing games where you have a rating of 9 here, but of course that puts you at a 1 here, versus you might have a 6 and a 4. You can only have a 10 and you have to choose where you put your points, kind of thing. There's a lot of that kind of discussion about leadership and about how certain things work, that is working across the narrative. You get to see it in action, and I thought that was really compelling.
Yeah, and like, to the point where the enemies, they kind of rule on high. One of the leaders is so fat he can't really hardly move around, and just compared that with Paul. He's fighting with the guys, like he's in the trenches, and kind of we see him becoming a leader through that.
Yeah, leading from on a throne versus leading from in front of your army, kind of thing. You see that difference between them. You see another case where Paul's father is leading through loyalty and through love, but then of course he's vulnerable because he doesn't have the money to potentially manipulate some of the other characters, and some of the people who, for whatever reason, because of his lack of cruelty, his enemy's cruelty makes him vulnerable as well, because they can take advantage of kidnapping someone very important, or abusing someone very important, that then gives someone who, even though they're loyal to their master, they're not as loyal to their master as they are to, say, a loved one, and now they're willing to flip. These sorts of things. The motivations of the various underlings and how all that works is really, really interesting.
I just see the Robert the Bruce scene in Braveheart where he's talking to his father. I want what he has. I want to love as he loves. Like, comparing William Wallace's leadership to the King of England, Edward the First.
Yeah, and
I mean, as portrayed in the movie, at least, which is
very,
maybe 1% correct.
Yeah, if that. But it's not a matter of it being correct historically. In Braveheart, that parallel, that comparison, is an important one, right? That is. And Robert the Bruce, of course, in Braveheart, those of you who haven't seen it, none more spoilers, but Robert the Bruce in Braveheart, of course, winds up having to turn on the man that he most admires, right? Mm-hmm. Because the very person that he doesn't want to have to give over to, that person holds power over him in other areas, in other ways. And it's the same way in this book, where you can see all these layers, in terms of marriage, in terms of various business connections, in terms of how are you going to choose to engage in your management and in your leadership. And the ways that you choose to do that involve choosing what your weaknesses are going to be and what your potential strengths are going to be, and all of it exposes you to some of the flaws of the people that you're with, and also of your own flaws. So what's the way to do it?
Well, and the first big test in the book is, how does Paul do under pain?
Right. Suffering. How can he handle suffering? And of course, one of the things that's really fascinating about that test is, what's the test for? Like, what do they call that test? It's a test to see whether he's human. As opposed to sort of the subhuman. It's interesting. It's whether he's really human or whether he's a subhuman in a human body, right? And so, you have this distinction. He's saying, but the pain, and it says pain, she sniffed. A human can override any nerve in the body. Right? And then, of course, he's telling him this litany against, or he's telling himself this litany against fear through the whole test. I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. And when it has gone past, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. And you have this idea of, and this is established right at the beginning of the book, that in order to truly be one, or in order to truly be human, you have to be able and willing to go through suffering that demonstrates your ability to distinguish between that which is painful but is not actually a part of you and is necessary for the advancement of of your growth as a human being and all these other things, and that which actually brings harm. And if it's just pain, a human can overcome this, and a human is willing to experience pain. And one of the things that's, and of course this is in the wake of a time where they had, gotten, this is, post apocalyptic in one sense, in that they had a time where they'd built computers or machines to do their thinking for them, and they had basically, it had led to humans being sort of less than human. So they've
Skynet.
Yeah,
it's Skynet.
Yeah, it's that sort of thing, or the Cylons or whatever. This concept that reappears over and over and over again in science fiction, but. This is basically a test to see whether or not you're going to overcome this, whether or not you're able to overcome this aspect of things. And being willing to suffer is a part of what it is to be human, and being able to suffer is what is a big part of what it is to be human.
And you contrast that with the enemy leadership, that it was all about pleasure.
Right. They do everything they can to avoid any sort of experience that would involve suffering, right? So I mean, even down to the fat ruler has a mech suit that helps him move around because he's lost his ability to move around. The mech suit is avoiding his having any sort of outside force engage upon him.
Yeah.
So, that group, by their trying to find ways around suffering by using their wealth and power, they become decreasingly human. Whereas the most human people are the Fremen, right? The Fremen, of course, the free men, but the Fremen are the most human in many respects, even though they're savages, effectively, right? And they're the most human because they're the most plugged into their ecology, the most plugged into their own suffering and their own connection with nature and all that it is to be a part of your larger environment. So there's a lot of interesting layers there. I did like this particular quote where when he, right after he's gone through that initial test, the old woman tells Paul, "Grave this on your memory, lad. A world is supported by three things." She held up 4 big-knuckled fingers. "The learning of the wise, the justice of the great, the prayers of the righteous, and the valor of the brave. But all of these are as nothing," she closed her fingers into a fist, "without a ruler who knows the art of ruling. Make that the science of your tradition." And that, in many respects, is what this book is about, right? I mean, you can talk, and again, we talked in the last segment about how Herbert intended this book to be about a lot of things, but one of the things it's definitely about is the art of ruling and how rule and management have to work. And in that sense, I mean, again, getting back to your complaint about, well, you're learning a language for something that doesn't apply. If you look at the ways that different people rule and the pitfalls and the downsides and some of the blind spots and also the advantages of different things, it does say a lot about how to manage. There's some executive lessons in this book.
Yeah. Yeah. And I enjoyed that part of it.
And then later on, we see another reflection on this, where a leader, you see, is one of the things that distinguishes a mob from a people. A leader maintains the level of individuals. Too few individuals and a people reverts to a mob. So you have to have liberty. A leader doesn't keep people from having liberty. A leader who does it right, who does it properly, maintains liberty in the people enough to make sure that the people doesn't just become a mob. A leader becomes a preserver of individual liberty. This is one of the things philosophically Herbert really wants to get across in this book. And you also see elsewhere where it talks about eventually these savages that are these Fremen savages that throughout the book you're sort of primed to be afraid of because of the way that the book is written in terms of perspective. At this point, the Fremen, as they gain a leader, you hear this quote. It says, "You see, gentlemen, they have something to die for. They've discovered they're a people. They're awakening." And that again gets back to this reflection of you're only human. You're only a human people. You're only a people once you've discovered not that there's something to live for, but something to die for. Only once there's something that you're willing to suffer and die for are you actually at a point of being a people or being fully human. Because animals have that, and you can see this kind of reflection in the way Herbert writes this. Animals have this self-preservation instinct and the desire to stay alive and to live. But humans can go a step further to where there's something that's worth even dying for. And that's something that can distinguish between, that which is in the idiom of the book, truly human, and that which isn't. So I really liked those particular themes.
Yeah, that was good stuff.
And that gets to your second point, looking at the show notes in terms of what the actual source of water or of life is.
Yeah, and that was cool. So they're on a dry planet, and blood is not the most important thing about life. Water is, to where they have these suits that, I guess, recycle any sweat or moisture so that it can be reused. And when someone dies, they talk about getting their water, and so that no water ever goes to waste on this planet. And it's interesting too because they come from a planet of abundant water, so it's a huge shift in how they think about precious resources. And then it flips everything up on its head too, to where if you spit at somebody, it's a token of respect.
Yeah, because you're willing to spend your water on that person.
Yeah, yep. And if you cry for somebody, that is a gift. They say it was a gift of the shadow world. Tears, they would be sacred beyond a doubt. So it was cool to think about things in that way. And then the main item on the planet is spice, and that's their most precious treasure. And a lot of people that have written about the book say that that's analogous to oil for us, where oil is kind of our big item that's in the ground, and then just the way in this book that spice is connected to the worms, the riding or the sandworms.
Right, and that's one of the
And
things that's really interesting is that, everybody wants the spice, but they're terrified of these worms, and it's not until very late in the book that suddenly you find out, like, and you can kind of, I mean, you start to guess earlier in the book, but late in the book you discover how it actually works, and the worms that everybody's terrified of are the source of the spice.
yeah, but everyone's afraid of them, and to overcome your fear, you have to actually ride the sandworm. So I thought there was a lot of neat analogy in that too of overcoming your fears in the sense of, and it was hard for Paul, the main character, for him to first do that, and he's around a group of people who have been riding sandworms forever, but for him to finally overcome that fear, and it's the main thing. I mean, a sandworm can take out a whole factory, it can take out a whole group of people, but you can also get on top of it and ride it. So it's just a lot of neat connection points in all of this with the water, the spice, the sandworm connection with the spice. The way to kill a sandworm is to drown it. So just a lot of neat components in how all that stuff worked together in the book.
Yeah, and again, it's fascinating that, spice is so needed and it's so valuable, but the source of the spice, again, it's like one of those RPO, or I mean, RPO, I've been doing too many football podcasts. It's like one of those RPG games, again, where, this, or rock, paper, scissors, right? This beats this, which beats this, which beats this, and it all goes into a circle. And again, everything is interrelated. And he, that kind of ecological perspective is something that Herbert really wants to emphasize in this book.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, and again, the same thing is the case in terms of how he puts religion and politics together. I mean, you get what's interesting is as you get compounds of various aspects of the world, they can be really strong, but then they also are doubly brittle, right? So you get this quote: "When religion and politics travel in the same cart, the riders believe nothing can stand in their way. Their movements become headlong, faster and faster and faster. They put aside all thought of obstacles and forget that a precipice does not show itself to the man in a blind rush until it's too late." So, religion serves as a great critiquer, or a great counter to politics in many cases. But as soon as they begin working together, as soon as they team up, now you have potential, additional double potential danger, because the thing that may have provided vision to warn you in the political realm, as soon as it gets appropriated by the thing that it was previously critiquing, now you're doubly blind. So there's some interesting stuff in terms of how they deal with that.
Yeah. And you had one other quote there at the bottom about religion and the...
Oh yeah. "All men must see that the teaching of religion by rules and rote is largely a hoax. The proper teaching is recognized with ease. You can know it without fail because it awakens within you that sensation which tells you this is something you've always known." And this is something I've had frequently in my life. Is, to me, the great writers are the ones where, and the great truths that I've encountered over my life are the ones where they're not telling me something I haven't known. It's all of a sudden like, oh man, like, yeah, that's the best. Like, that's how to put words to what I've known before. That phenomenon is, that is a phenomenon that we tend to have when we come into contact with that which we recognize to be true. It has that immediate, like, oh yeah, like, you've put words to what I've always known but haven't had words for. And
C.S. Lewis has some great quotes along those.
Yeah.
Lines.
Surprised by Joy has a lot of discussion of this phenomenon as well, that, great art connects with that internal longing that is there from the time that you're a child on. And, it's that, and for him, all truth is just uh, you know, further lines in one grand song, right? It's the just you hear the chorus of a song that you've always known, but you've not known the words to, these sorts of things. There's all sorts of different ways of this. Uh, every song is just a variation of the great song, and Herbert again explores that here, and he does so in some ways by finding all sorts of ways to syncretize for the narrative purpose the terminology of multiple religions, a number of wisdom sayings that are parallel across religions, and all sorts of different things. And he tries to take various pieces of say Hinduism and Islam and Christianity and Judaism and various other forms of religious practice and belief, and meld them into a futuristic, like, okay, well, we've exceeded these sectarian divisions, we've gotten past that to a deeper truth that's reflected in this particular larger religious way of thinking that gets to the bottom of what all of these were trying to get to in a more primitive form, centuries ago, sort of thing. And again, that's the way that he does it. If you know those religious traditions, if you know various religious traditions fairly well, you can see all sorts of different places where he's borrowing from here and adding to that and subtracting this, etc. It's an interesting little game of discovering where he's hidden what and what he's doing.
Well, and question for you on the for the OC Bible that they keep referring to, what does that refer to? Is that the Bible like from the other land, or is that their specific Bible?
Yeah, so this is a narrative thing that it doesn't exist. It's a creation of his back. It's his it's a creation of his particular world that, again, he's created all sorts of additional aspects of it that exceed it. So he has all these quotes from the OC Bible, and there's also in the appendix you get to see some discussion of the religion of Dune, right, and the various forms of practice and all this from the B'nai Gesserit and these sorts of things. The Bible that he's talking about, the OC Bible, is the Orange Catholic Bible, and it's it's in the mythology that he's putting together, in the history underlying all of this stuff. So it's part of those edges. It's out beyond the edges. It's the followers of the 14 sages whose book was the Orange Catholic Bible and whose views are expressed in the commentaries and others. You have these sorts of things. So the Orange Catholic Bible is the book of the 14 sages, right?
Okay, because there's one quote here. Jessica, Paul's mother, is thinking. So this is one of those quotes in italics, and she says, "A time to get and a time to lose." Jessica thought, quoting to herself from the OC Bible, "A time to keep and a time to cast away, a time for love and a time to hate, a time of war, a time of peace," which is Ecclesiastes. So sometimes, like the OC Bible, it would be things that we recognize, but then other times it seemed to be other things.
Right. Well, I mean, and if you know other aspects of the of other religious traditions, you recognize that many of the other things that are quoted from the Orange Catholic Bible, from the OC Bible, those things are quotes or very near quotes or paraphrases from, say, Islam or the Bhagavad Gita or different things where he's pulling in different ideas there and boiling that down. So
Okay.
and again in the appendix he gives you a little bit of the history of this. So what happens is after all sorts of different wars and generations of violence and all this, It says the leaders of religions whose followers had spilled the blood of billions began meeting to exchange views. It was a move encouraged by the Spacing Guild, which was beginning to build its monopoly over all interstellar travel, and by the Bene Gesserit, who are banding the sorceresses. And what they do is they come together for ecumenical purposes, and they get to various religious agreements. And so it says for almost 7 years, this particular commission of ecumenical translators, these leaders of religions who are trying to get together to, make something syncretistic out of their previously sectarian religions. After 7 years, they unveil the Orange Catholic Bible. And, here is a work with dignity and meaning, they said. Here is a way to make humanity aware of itself as a total creation of God. The men of CET were likened to archaeologists of ideas, inspired by God and the grandeur of rediscovery. It was said they had brought to light the vitality of great ideals overlaid by the deposits of centuries, and that they had sharpened the moral imperatives that come out of a religious conscience. So basically, it's his idea that, if we could just get past some of the specific iterations of this to say no, it has to be in this particular sectarian way, that that various religious insights are shared across religions and across cultures, and that you could more or less kind of summarize those in some ways. And his way of representing that is this fictional Orange Catholic Bible.
Okay, cool. One other question for you: have you seen this movie?
I have not.
I haven't either. I mean, after reading this, I looked at it to potentially rent it, but I think it's from the '80s, so it looks a little old, and then I was just thinking, how do you even begin to get a book this rich and this big into a 2-hour movie?
Yeah, well, and especially in some of in the era in which that one was done, it I can't imagine that it would be quite as well done as it might be. Yikes.
Yeah, well, yeah, special effects would be found wanting. But
yeah,
well, should we get into? Should we conclude?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can get back to the big picture. So and conclude on that. Yeah, so I'll let you go first.
Yeah, so when thinking about the books of the books of Titans, there's in ranking them or thinking of how much I enjoyed them, there's kind of two different criteria. One is how good is the book? I mean, is it a well-written book? Is it complex? Does it have all these features of what make a good novel or a good book? And then there's also, like, did I enjoy it? Did me, Eric, I personally, did I enjoy this book? And so on the first part there, yes, it's a great book, great piece of work, lots going on, a ton of stuff way over my head. So I know if I read it again, I'd get a lot more, a lot there. And then there's more books that go along with the series. But on the second part of it, I just didn't enjoy it, and I'm not a fan of it. And I just think, like, I've got this burning desire to read War and Peace, and instead of reading a 700-800 page book of Dune, I would have rather have read something like War and Peace. And so there's only so much time in your life to read some of these bigger books. For me personally, I would have rather have read something like War and Peace than Dune. That's not to negate the power of this book. It was excellent. I loved the dialogue, all that kind of stuff. But I was not a fan.
Yeah, well, I, on the other hand, really liked it, and I'll probably end up reading more in this series. So, and that doesn't mean I won't read War and Peace as well when we finally put that on our list for next year, I suppose. Yeah. But yeah, I found this very compelling, and I'm as much as you're not a fan of sci-fi and space and all that stuff, I'm kind of a sucker for it. So this was very much up my alley. I love fantasy and sci-fi type literature. Don't get enough time to read it, but this being on the list, this is one of my favorites so far. So, everything from the way that he handled the religion and politics aspects to the ecology stuff. I love, there's one other quote I have to get in there. The untrained might miss that collapse until it was too late. That's why the highest function of ecology is the understanding of consequences. And you see throughout this book all of this idea of unintended consequences and intended consequences having unintended consequences, right?
Yeah.
So I just love the way that this is so thoroughly layered. I think it's a classic. I think in 100 years this will be another book that will be studied as long as certain demographics of authors are still allowed to be studied at that point in literature classes. I think that this is going to be one of those classics of the century in which it was written, or of the era in which it was written, and is one of those that's worth reading for just about everybody. Unless, of course, you are too old for fairy tales and fantasy and sci-fi and not yet old enough for them again. So, yeah, so I really enjoyed it.
It's awesome. Yeah, maybe after my midlife crisis, I can revisit it.
Yeah, your daughter's getting just old enough where she's going to be, give her a few years and she'll want this sort of book, and that's when Daddy will start returning to some of these, I'm sure.
Yeah, that'd be fun. I'm looking forward to reading the Narnia series to her, and
yeah, that's fun
stuff like that. So.
All right, well, that's gonna go ahead and do it for us today. Let's get out of here. Now, before we do, just a reminder: you can follow along with us at booksoftitans.com. You can also interact with us on Twitter or Instagram at Books of Titans. If you haven't done so, please subscribe to the podcast. Find all of our past episodes through iTunes. Apple Podcasts, the Android Marketplace, or your podcast manager of choice. May we recommend, and we are not actually sponsored by them, but may we recommend Overcast, which is a tremendous podcast manager. If you are enjoying the podcast, please recommend us to friends. Give us 5-star ratings. Share everything possible. Write a letter to your grandmother about how she's got to download our stuff and how much it'll make her appreciate and love literature once again. We'll be back soon to discuss the next book, which will be Heraclitean Fire by Erwin Chalgroff. On behalf of Eric Rostad, I'm Jason Staples. This has been the Books of Titans podcast. Thanks for listening. Now keep listening, keep reading, and keep improving.
And keep it selectively real.
I made this.